You are listening to the Think Brick Australia podcast. Think Brick Australia represents the clay, brick and paver manufacturers of Australia. Brick by brick, our podcast will discuss technical information and architectural case studies with special guests. I'm your host, Elizabeth McIntyre, the CEO of Think Brick Australia. On today's podcast, I am delighted to welcome back one of our civil engineers, Mina Matta. Welcome.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Okay, Mina, today we're going to talk about the NCC 2022 and some of the changes to clay masonry construction. And I think we're going to divide this into two volumes, Volume 1 and Volume 2.
That is correct.
What are we going to talk about in Volume 1?
Yep. So the first thing that we're going to go through is some general changes to Volume 1. Mm-hmm. So evidence of suitability and its general structure. After that, we're actually going to talk about some of the deemed to satisfy provisions. So we're going to look at weatherproofing and combustibility specifically.
Perfect. And then we'll move on to Volume 2.
Yep.
So let's start off with Volume 1. What have been the main changes to evidence of suitability?
Yep. So just backtracking to what evidence of suitability is. So the NCC 2022 has its requirements as a way that we actually measure whether it's met its requirements through the evidence of suitability. So they've added a new section under Section A5G3. These permit the use of house energy rating software, provided that an NatHERS certificate is issued. So generally what we have is you have an assessor producer certificate, and that deems the structure to actually meet the 7-star requirement.
Right. So what's the key difference with the evidence of suitability now in 2022 than from before?
Yep. So we've had new additions under Section A5G9. These permit the use of house energy rating software, provided that a NatHERS certificate is actually used. So one of the main differences that we've actually seen between NCC 2019 and NCC 2022 is that NCC 2019 only required 6 stars energy efficiency ratings, whereas NCC 2022 required 7 stars. Yeah, we are moving towards those higher energy efficiency targets.
And the best way you get them is to build in brick. All right, let's then talk about the next thing, structure.
We've actually seen something quite interesting. Generally, whenever you want to actually improve something or break it down, you'd get all the sections that's required and you put them in a table.
Mm-hmm.
We've actually seen this happen throughout the NCC several times. But they've actually introduced quite an interesting change where they've actually rolled that back.
Okay.
So instead what they've done is they've converted all the tables back into plain text. It's a debatable change, but it certainly is something that
it's gone
keeps
from
the industry interesting. Yeah.
From table back to text. All
That's
right.
it.
Talking now about weatherproofing. What's happened here?
Weatherproofing is one of those sections that's actually quite interesting within the NCC. So if you have a look within the NCC 2019 Volume 2, we actually list AS 3700 as a deemed to satisfy construction manual governing that requirement. But when you actually look at Volume 1 within 2019, there is no such. Mm-hmm. And the byproduct of this is that eventually you'd have to get an engineer that has to go through either the verification methods or other methods within the NCC to actually certify it. It makes it a lot more difficult and a lot more risky to actually build in masonry. So what we've actually seen within NCC 2022 is that AS 3700 has been identified as deemed to satisfy with respect to weatherproofing.
So it means you don't really need to go and get additional certification.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Easy. Okay. Now we're going to head to combustibility. This is one of my favourite topics and one of the best changes that's come in.
As it is mine.
Tell us about what's happened.
To understand the significance of this change, you actually need to see what happened in the past. We had consultants actually come out and ask us whether some of our products were actually non-combustible. And this is actually really important because generally for a product to be deemed non-combustible, it has to meet the requirements of AS 1530.1. But that is rather inappropriate when it comes to masonry. Masonry is already fired within a kiln at 1200 C. I mean, it makes no sense for us to do additional testing. So what this change will, including it as non-combustible, will increase design confidence and may actually reduce the rigidity within the approval pathways.
That's right. It's making it a lot easier. And I like to say you don't have to fire up because we already have with masonry. Yep. And that's where you've got your non-combustibility. It's a fantastic change in the National Construction Code.
That definitely is quite an interesting way to put it.
Now let's go on to Volume 2. What are we looking at here?
Volume 2 has introduced several changes. There's actually been a tremendous change to structure.
Mm-hmm.
We've also had inclusion of acceptable construction practices pertaining to masonry.
So let's just go back to structure, Mina. what has been the biggest change here in structure?
Yeah, so the way that NCC 2019 and previous NCC documents have been set up is that they generally had the deemed to satisfy construction manuals, and right after them we would have what we call acceptable construction practice. The changes within NCC 2022 that you have the acceptable construction manuals, but there's also been a separation of the acceptable construction practice into a different document.
Yep.
And what this allows for is it allows for more fluidity when you actually come to read it, and it makes it a lot more clear.
Okay, Mina, so now we're going to talk about inclusion of acceptable construction practices, or as I like to abbreviate, ACPs.
Yep. So previously within the NCC 2019 and former NCC versions, unreinforced masonry, reinforced masonry, masonry accessories, and weatherproofing did not include any acceptable construction practices.
So what did that mean, Mina? Like, does that mean you had to then go and find out and get everything certified?
It means that you had to have gone through the actual standard, so either AF 3700 or 4773 directly.
Right.
And one of the problems with this is on a global scale, it actually reduces the accessibility of building with masonry, because these standards, they are paid. Mm-hmm. And especially for small businesses, it actually increases their risk. But what we've seen is that generally sections of the standard have actually also been included within these acceptable construction practices and moved to the ABCB housing provisions.
So, Mina, specifically, what are some of the actual items that have been included in the ACPs?
Yep. So within the ACPs, we've actually had several sections, as I said before: the unreinforced single leaf masonry, reinforced masonry, cavity, and masonry veneer all have additions. We've had provisions that have been introduced specifically for masonry components and accessories. So we've actually increased the minimum compressive strength from 3 to 5 MPa if you go down the ACP pathway. That actually matches the requirements of AS 3700 Section 3. Denoting the minimum compressive strengths. But we've also had increased stringency with regards to minimum wall tie strengths.
Yep.
Especially within cavity masonry, wind regions greater than N1 require medium duty, whereas the N1 wind region only requires light duty ties. And that actually accommodates for some of the things that we've been experiencing around the country, where we've had masonry walls come apart due to insufficient wall tie strength.
Okay, so great. So I think what we've been able to do here, and I'm just going to go back to make sure I've got it all correct in my mind. In Volume 1 of the NCC, we've seen some changes around evidence of suitability. And what we talked about there was moving from 6-star to 7-star rating, but also requiring the assessor to produce a certificate. We then looked at structure, where the structural change to this was converting tables through to text. We then went on to look at weatherproofing. And again, here, previous versions for weatherproofing in the NCC had no deemed to satisfy requirements, whereas now they do. And we then looked at combustibility. Again, my favourite, remembering that brick is fired at over 1200 degrees Celsius. We don't need to worry about brick being combustible. So then we go into structure in Volume 2, and here's what they've done is they've broken down all the tables to make it a lot simpler. And they've also, when we look at acceptable construction practices, they've included a lot of things that we would have assumed would have been in the NCC, but in fact haven't. And some of those things you touched on, Mina, were around sort of openings in masonry constructions, lintels, and more importantly, the things that bind us all together, wall ties. That's one thing that has been changed, as well as compression strength. So, Mina, thank you for taking us through all of these changes to the National Construction Code that relate to clay masonry. Mina, you know that I always like to do two things at once. Where can our listeners go for more information?
Yeah, so listeners can definitely go down to the show notes, or they can actually visit our website, especially when it comes to changes within the NCC 22. We'll be releasing quite a few fact sheets that actually demonstrate all the changes pertaining to masonry.
And also don't forget that if you want to speak to Mina personally, you can call up our technical hotline and you'll get our team on the line. Mina, thank you for taking us through the National Construction Code changes, particularly with regards to clay masonry. And if you're thinking of brick, it's a lot easier to comply now in the National Construction Code 2022. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please follow, rate, and review our podcast. We are always looking for new ways to think brick. If you have an idea of what you'd like to hear about, there's a link in our show notes to let us know.